So let's get started. If my little tabby thingy is correct, we are on Mishnah number 17.
Ouch.
237.
See you guys later.
Thank you, Robin.
Yeah, that's what we have.
Okay, so last week we looked at a Mishnah by Rabban Gamliel. Rabban Gamliel is, I'll say, sort of famous in that he is mentioned in our Haggadah in the passage where it says Rabban Gamliel Haya Omer. Rabban Gamliel used to say and teach that anyone who has not said the following three things at the Seder has not fulfilled their obligation, that one has to talk about the Pesach offering, matzah, and maror. So at least once a year, we talk about Rabban Gamliel at our Seder. Rabban Gamliel has a son named Shimon. Shimon will eventually succeed his father as the leader of the Jewish community and the head of the Sanhedrin. And Shimon will have a son named Gamliel, who will have a son named Shimon. Are you noticing a little pattern here?
Yeah.
Okay. So, and at this point in Jewish life, the leadership of the Sanhedrin is somewhat dynastic, whereas previously it was more about sort of meritocracy, if you will. Right? And as I noted, Rabban Gamliel is living already in the beginnings of the decline of the Jewish state, and his son Shimon is living during the period of the destruction by the Romans and the aftermath thereof. Right? So just to give you a little context of what he's experiencing in the middle and late first century of the Common Era.
I have a question.
Yes.
The names Amoraic and Tanaic. What do they mean? And they seem to be,
Okay.
look up, they're 200 CE or something, seems to be a division.
Okay.
Kind of.
So a Tana had several meanings, right? In its most literal sense, a Tana was literally the human recording device. Right? So you would say to the person designated as a Tana, please give us, Mishnah X.
That'd be like a scribe?
Yes, but it was oral.
Oral, okay.
All right, so there was someone who literally had an excellent memory. At times, that person was not necessarily knowledgeable in Jewish law, but they had this amazing memory. So they could memorize and then access and then put forth incredible amounts of information. Right? But a Tana also refers to the rabbis of the period up to the conclusion of the Mishnah. All right, so Rabban Gamliel would be a Tana. Shimon, his son, would be a Tana. That whole Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi Meir, all the people that we encounter in the Mishnah are Tanaim, plural of Tana, right? And they exist in the Tanaitic area because it refers to all of the sages who operate in the late rabbinic period prior to the completion of the Mishnah.
And that
Right.
was Judah HaNasi.
Yehuda Anasi would be like the end of that chain, if you will. Now, now understand that just because he finished writing the Mishnah doesn't mean that the guy suddenly changed names, right? Or changed from being Tanaim to not Tanaim. But the next generation of scholars and sages, up through the conclusion of the writing of the Talmud, are called Amoraim. And they're the ones who engage in the discourse and debate and discussion that becomes the Talmud. And when it is not uncommon in certain scholarly circles to identify a particular scholar as being a Tana or an Amora, and you would say a Tana of the first generation, third generation, fifth generation.
Mhm.
You know, an Amora of the first, second, third, fourth, whatever generation, as a way of trying to place them in the time historical sequence.
Thank you. That the word literally in Hebrew would mean
Tana is actually Aramaic.
Oh.
Its Hebrew equivalent would be Shana, not Shana as in year, but Shana as in repeat.
good.
Right? And it's the same root that gives us the word Mishnah or teaching.
Right.
So that dual aspect of Shana, the one who repeats, like that's the original meaning, the guy who just spews out the passage. And a Tana is someone who teaches us. And the record of that is in the Mishnah.
Yeah. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so here we're being introduced to Shimon, the son of Rabban Gamliel, who I'm guessing is still a relatively young man at this point because we're not introduced to him with his title. But in the next Mishnah, if you peek to the next Mishnah, you'll see that in the next Mishnah, he is Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, having ascended to replace his father with that title.
Rabban, yeah.
Okay, Rabban, our teacher,
Yeah.
as opposed to Rabbi, my teacher. All right, so let's see what Shimon the younger has to say. All my days I have grown up among the sages, and I have never found anything quite as physically pleasing as silence. Anybody want to take a guess at what he is talking about?
Well, speak little and do much, I guess.
Well, he doesn't say do much
Right.
yet. He's going to say that in the next part, so I don't want to,
I was saying, hear and listen and hear.
Okay, listen. All right.
And you hear when you listen.
Yeah, the more you listen, the more you will hear. All right. But think about how he introduces it. All my days I grew up amongst the sages.
Well,
And I discovered as a result that there's nothing better than silence.
He listened to the sages. That's
so if you're quiet, you learn.
they spoke and he listened.
Okay, so you're sort of doing it on a positive side.
Right.
All right, that I'm surrounded by all of this knowledge. And the best thing I can do is keep my mouth shut, my head down, and just listen. Right?
Okay.
Now, think back for a moment over the years that you were in school. Were all of your teachers equally erudite, insightful?
No, they were human.
Okay.
True.
Right? So I think part of what he's also hinting at here is the idea that he's observing all of these sages who are literally in and out of his house and his household all the time because of his father's role and standing and position in the community, right? And at a certain point, he's going like, okay, oh, I'm gonna listen to him, but I'm not necessarily gonna listen to him, right? Because he is verbose. He's a lot of verbiage, but there may not be any there, as opposed to this guy, succinct,
So. you're-
direct, and therefore easily understood. Right? So I think he's taking away not just the idea of listening as a quality, but also how do you go about presenting stuff?
So you will become selective if you listen.
And you sort of watch and say, if I have to emulate someone, I'd rather be more like this guy than that guy. And part of it is just watching how other people react to others. Without mentioning any names, we have all been in classes where a given individual raises their hand and is recognized to speak, and you can just watch the whole class go. Because you know that whoever that person is going to ramble. And very often, not only will they ramble on point, they will ramble off of point. Right? So what happens? You turn off that person, you stop listening. Right? I sort of think about it in terms of two of my teachers, now both of blessed memory. But one was Professor Moshe Greenberg, who was a professor of Bible at Hebrew University. Right? His lectures were incomparable. Right? You know how you take notes in a lecture and sometimes you feel like, oh, I got to go back and neaten that up. And you look at my notebook from his class and you would swear that I rewrote the whole thing. But it was just from taking his class. That's how ordered and structured he was. Right? He would get to the end and he would say, Adkan, until here. And you'd go like, oh, wait, no, that could not possibly have been an hour. He was probably the best lecturer I ever had. On the other extreme, right, and I'm not going to mention any names in this one, I had an opportunity to study Jewish law with a great legal authority who was also acknowledged as one of the world's foremost experts on Greek and Roman law, especially the Roman part of it. Right? Look, Roman law, understanding Roman law and during the rabbinic era, very consequential and important. Right? So I've got this guy who is acknowledged as a master in the field of Roman law and an expert in Jewish law. But I had two columns in my notebook for his classes. Column one was the skinny column, in which I took notes on the subject. And column two was the much wider column in which I recorded all of these stories and anecdotes that he used to share. Very rarely were they related to the topic, but they were great stories and they were great anecdotes, which is why I and many of my other classmates used to write them down, and they were funny as heck. Right? But I just want to sort of give you this image of this notebook which captured the lecture because it was presented so meticulously and precisely. And this other one where I literally had two columns to separate the wheat from the chaff. Right? And I remember, coming to the end of the semester and going like, there's a lot more chaff than there is wheat, which is kind of normal in the grain industry. But here I'm thinking, if he could have done half of what this other guy did, how much more would I have learned over the course of the year? Right? So when the opportunity to take another class with him came along, I didn't. It just didn't feel
Mhm.
worth it. Right? So maybe I'm bringing some of that experience into this, and I'm thinking like, okay, I'm going to listen to him, but I'm not going to listen to him. And how am I going to engage with and present myself to others? How do I get that clarity in communication? So, there is a thing called exegesis and eisegesis. Oh,
Walked in, I said, do you have kosher for Passover? Big wine, the Slavana, she was like,
Slivovitz.
yeah, she said Old Plum Brandy, and she picked it up. She said, yeah, kosher for Passover, right?
Yeah.
Awesome.
Where'd you
Which-
get yours?
I don't drink this stuff.
No,
This
but
is
where'd
for
you
the-
get it?
The ABC in
ABC store.
Highwood.
I said, can you order? She said, yeah, we can order whatever you need. And then she said, well, what are you looking for? I told her, $26.48.
Okay, will
Yeah.
you just send Evelyn a text or an email or something that says, and then
Should
we-
I put it on her desk?
yeah, hold on to it in the office for now.
Okay.
But
We have a bottle of that at home with Brian.
everybody's got a bottle of it at home because nobody drinks it.
Oh, yeah. My grandfather always did with his cousin. I'd have shots on his side. I can tell you what. Awesome. Good story.
So,
So what do I do?
that was,
Our translation says that nothing becomes a person more than silence. So that kind of suggests that silence is a positive attribute.
absolutely. And I'm not negating that, but I'm just trying to say that I think there's something more. So I was trying to explain exegesis and eisegesis. Exegesis is when you try to study and understand the text. Eisegesis is not necessarily a positive thing because it means that you are sort of reading into the text as opposed to allowing the text to speak for itself. So I don't know if I just did a little bit of eisegesis in, overlaying my experience and that polarity in those two professors onto this and how I perceive people who are presenters. Okay, so there's also a teaching in the Midrash that says they talk about Torah having 70 faces, right? In rabbinic literature, that there were thought to be 70 nations in the world, right? So the idea was that having 70 facets meant that was complete, total, right? But each time you look at something from a different viewpoint, you see it a little differently. And that enables you to understand it from a slightly different perspective. So amongst the 70 perspectives on Torah, there is an idea that one of those perspectives is silence. Just not just hear the words, but hear the silences between the words, between the chapters, between even the letters.
hear what's not being said.
Yes. Right. So for him to suggest silence, it may be not just the idea of being quiet so you can take in, but really enter into the silence to discover. Right. And I think that goes sort of even beyond the idea of silence as being a portal to wisdom or engagement. I think you can also, if you want to take it very, very basically, silence precludes one from saying something foolish or hurtful. What's the old joke about, better to be thought a fool than to open one's mouth and remove all doubt? And so perhaps part of what he observed, it's the antithesis of my loquacious guy. It's, I watched these guys sit in silence. I watched these guys, really speak when it was necessary, when they had something positive to contribute to the conversation. Okay. Now we get to the part that Sam was alluding to. V'lo hamidrash hu ha'ikar ela ha'ma'aseh. Learning is not the essential thing, but rather doing.
Ours is very different. It says not study.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Well, learning when they say study, they mean study of Torah. Learning means study of Torah, right? So I don't think they're hinting at something different other than just slightly different vocabulary, right? And in Hebrew, the word that they use is midrash. Midrash is the process of expounding on verses. So the root for the word midrash is dalid resh shin, darash, which means to search out or to seek out new meaning. It's very Star Trek. So the process of study is an act of midrash. The product of that process is also called midrash. So midrash is the process of studying Torah, and the product of that study is this thing that we call midrash. So when I or some other rabbi says, the midrash says, what I'm really saying is this vast body of literature has this teaching in it. And this teaching is a product of this vast process called midrash, in which I seek out, search out, try to understand the various possible meanings of the text. And the midrashic process does not worry about whether or not this midrashic teaching contradicts this midrashic teaching, because I'm operating in a universe in which there are 70 facets of the Torah, which means that if I'm looking at it from this facet, this one is true. If I'm looking at it from over here, this one is true. Right. Even though when I butt them up against each other, they may contradict each other, but in a more global sense, the meaning of the text is learner relative, right? Or viewer relative, right? What's the old joke? If you're the back end of a two-person costume, the view never changes. But otherwise, how anybody views something is very much viewer dependent because each of us brings to the study of this text, of any text, all our lifetime of experiences and learning. Right? So I'm gonna pick something kind of randomish, but if we are talking about if the mission is dealing with events that happen aboard a vessel, Sam's experience and mine are really different. Right? And in some cases, yours might be much more valuable to the discussion than mine because I never lived aboard a ship. All right. So if the mission is talking about, well, this is what happens, this is how you have to do things in order to make Shabbat work on board ship. Well, I have nothing to bring to that table of conversation because I've never been aboard a ship on Shabbat. And, you know, so I could learn from Sam's experience or my father-in-law, blessed memory, his experience. Even though my father-in-law wasn't Shabbat observant when he was in the Navy, there was a whole lot about the rhythm of the ship and what work and responsibility and a whole lot of stuff that is not part of my vocabulary of experience. So how Sam might read that Mishnah versus how I might read the Mishnah could be really, really different because viewer perspective comes into play.
There's saying that I heard before that says all knowledge is contextual. And that context can change with time and place, generation.
Absolutely.
And
absolutely true. I think that bears up. That's sort of the same thing, you know, perhaps a terser fashion.
Mhm. Very good.
How you look at something depends on where you are in your life.
Mm-hmm.
So in Ramban's Mishnah Torah,
Mm-hmm.
he lists the entire 613, his illustration of the
Yes,
number.
his
give
list of what he thinks the 613
right,
commandments are. Yeah.
Give a reference from the Torah, the written Torah.
Mm-hmm.
And so is everybody proceeding from that listing?
No.
Okay, so they're different.
There are different lists.
Okay.
All right. It was one of the fun things that people did to amuse themselves in the Middle Ages was write lists, their own list of the 613 commandments. Hey, they didn't have cable. They didn't have, Sirius XM radio. They had a lot of time on their hands to do stuff, and they also had a lot less rabbinic material to go through. So
access other stuff.
so Rambam has his list, and the Sefer Mitzvot Hagadol has its list, and there are other lists. And look, to say that there's a lot of overlap between them is certainly true, but the fact that you have significant scholars of the medieval period who are creating differing lists of what the 613 commandments, which we think of as being, basic, is a mind-blowing idea. I think we did this little game one year when we read the last year when we read the 10 Commandments.
Right.
And the question was, okay, what are the no, I didn't do it for the Ten Commandments. I did it for somewhere in Deuteronomy. You know, but the fact is, sometimes it's hard to decide, well, is this mitzvah part A, and then the next verse is part B? Are they two separate mitzvot?
Right.
I don't know. But you can make arguments backwards and forwards. In the same way that is, I am the Lord your God who brought you up out of the land of Egypt. Is that a commandment?
Statement.
It's a commandment according to our ark.
I guess the first part would be a command, I'm your
Well,
God.
well, yes, because it's read as being a statement of belief with which you are required to agree. But the reality is that it's much easier to make an argument that says that is a preamble and not a command. And guess what? If it's not a commandment, I still have 10. And it may even have 12. Right? Right. So part of what we're discovering is that the guys in the Middle Ages have inherited this tradition that there are 613 commandments. Well, if there are 613 commandments articulated in the Torah, I want to know what they are. The fact that the Torah never says there are 613 tells me that that's a later idea that's grafted on.
So it becomes arbitrary.
It becomes somewhat arbitrary, but it also means that one can have legitimate disagreements, and part of the process is figuring out what's a commandment.
So Rabbi, so
What's the
so
commandment?
if a Mishnah is a
It's
list,
a do it or else.
if the Mishnahs are lists, and
Well,
we call each one of these verses in Pirkei Avot, a Mishnah, then this is a list of Pirkei Avot, our fathers.
okay.
Correct?
I don't know that I would look at the Mishnah is not so much a list as a compendium.
Okay, so this
The reason I draw the distinction is usually when you have a list, what's his name made David Letterman and his top 10 lists were a phenomenon. I mean, so much so that there are literally books of his top 10 lists that have been published, right?
okay.
So lists are often a way of structuring material, but oftentimes have an arbitrary number. Casey Kasem did America's top 40. Why 40? Why not 42 or 50 or some other number, right?
Right.
On one level, a list can be an arbitrary way of cutting off something. All right, as opposed to, actually, I like this when they did it, right? So radio stations will often do like extended weekend things where we're going to play the top 500 albums or songs of all time. Okay, that's a lot of songs. Or sometimes what they will do is we're going to play every song that hit #1 on the charts. Some one-hit wonder that made it to #1 on the chart might not make it into my group of 500 top songs, right? Because the number of #1 hits is greater than the top 500 songs that I might arbitrarily choose, because I'm ranking them instead of 1 to 100. I'm now ranking them 1 to 500.
Right.
But I'm imposing a ranking, as opposed to we're going to start in 1952 and play every song that hit #1 on the Billboard chart. let's assuming that's when billboards started, but we're gonna play every #1 top billboard hit. We're gonna be here for a month, but we're gonna do it. Right? So it's a different kind of list. Am I creating a list as a way of defining a field, or am I just creating a list that is open? By creating a list of 613 in which there can't be more or less than 613, I therefore have to look at stuff and say, is that a commandment or not? If I were just to say to Sam, read through the Bible and write down everything that you think is a commandment,
Good luck.
right? I haven't given you a number, which means theoretically you could come up with 412 or 732, depending on how you read the text.
Right. Right. Or you could come up with commandments that would have had to have been done in order to do that particular commandment
It's
that you
right.
wrote down.
But if I have a number that I have to use, I can't have less and I can't have more. Which means that I now have to make choices as to, is this one commandment? Is this two commandments? Is this all part of one larger commandment?
Right. Well, did Yehuda Nasi write the Mishnah? The capital letters?
He is the final redactor
Okay.
of what we call the Mishnah,
Okay.
right? For several generations prior to Yehuda Nasi, you have sages like Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Akiva who are engaging in the process of aggregating similar material
Mhm.
topically.
So he's gathering it.
All right. So Rabbi Meir had lists of laws on a topic, and Rabbi Akiva was doing the same thing. And there were others. Why? Because at a certain point, the material becomes overly cumbersome to have it just kind of be free floating. And part of that is the challenge of the Bible, the Torah itself talks about the same subject in multiple places, right? So yes, it's easy to say, oh, 10 commandments, observe the Sabbath day to keep it holy. Cool. Yeah, I got that one. Very nice. Thank you very much. Okay. All right. But it repeats the same thing with a few differences in Deuteronomy. It also talks about the observance of Shabbat in Parshat Ki Tisa in connection with the building of the Mishkan. It also talks about the observance of Shabbat in the book of Leviticus. What do you know? And it mentions the observance of Shabbat in the book of Numbers. The only book of the Torah that doesn't talk in any way about Shabbat is the book of Breshit, the book of Genesis. Right? So if in fact I have all of these things, and up till the post-destruction of the Second Temple period, all the rules that I developed around the observance of Shabbat that were connected to its iteration in the book of Exodus. By the way, it's also mentioned 2 other times in the book of Exodus, right? So I have a cluster of material that's over here. And I have a cluster of material over here, and I have a little bit here, and I have a little bit there, and another bit here. That's not convenient. And that doesn't make it easy to make sure that I know everything I need to know about Shabbat. So Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Akiva and the other Tanaim of those generations begin to aggregate all of this material and put it into a structure where it is thematically linked. So if over here I'm talking about aspects of Shabbat related to fire, then I talk about aspects of Shabbat related to fire. And in this chapter, I talk about aspects of Shabbat related to cooking. And here I talk about, food production. and here I talk about carrying, and here, I've taken all the material that's all over the place, and I've now brought it together in an organized sort of way. Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi is the one who essentially says the process of aggregating and organizing all of this material is done. We have finished. He's the final editor, the final redactor. He's the final word and says, this is the Mishnah. And anything that's not in here is important, but it is not the Mishnah, which is why you have this other book called the Tosefta, which both replicates and differs from the Mishnah. But it's the same style and purpose. It's just, this is the official, this is the unofficial transcript, if you will. All right, so when he says, Lo HaMidrash, that learning, study, the process of knowledge is not the essential, but rather actions speak louder than words. He's actually making a statement that is consequential, because there's the Talmud in Masechet Kiddushin, in the Tractate of Kiddushin, records a debate between Rabbi Tarfon and Rabbi Akiva, both of whom will be appearing briefly in your Haggadah on Pesach. Right.
Yeah.
They each get a cameo. It's very nice. All right. But there's a debate between Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Tarfon as to which is greater, study or action. Okay. Shimon here says action is greater and more important than study. In the Talmud's version of the debate between Rabbi Tarfon and Rabbi Akiva, the conclusion is actually the opposite, with a caveat. They suggest that study is greater, for it leads to action. In other words, the more you study, the more you know what is required, expected, or desirable as actions. Right? So on one level, the Talmud's trying to have its cake and eat it too. Right? Because what did they do? They made study more important, but not exclusively as a intellectual exercise, but because it enables you to act properly.
Why isn't it both? Somebody must have said both, right?
Yeah, I think.
Somewhere in the world,
Well, because
because you
You
gotta
need
have,
one to have the other.
well, that's kind of what the Talmud is saying, is that but the difference is you can have action without study.
Yeah.
but what would it be based, what would that action
But I could go
be
wrong with
acting
that.
on? I mean, what would?
Well, but you could have positive actions without study. All right. It's called on one level. How does that work? It's called it's sort of like a mimetic society in which you are taught how to act and how to behave. Right.
Okay.
And I'm trying to think of.
Do as I say, not as I.
Well,
or as you
not
think.
even that.
Yeah,
Not
no,
even
I
that.
know.
But it's more like, okay. Where let's put ourselves into a traditional Jewish home for a moment, right? I'll use my home. All right. My children learned about certain things long before they learned about certain other things. For example, they knew that ice cream meant you go to that drawer because it's the dairy drawer. And you go to that if we're having burgers, and they learned how to do kashrut long before they had any concept of kashrut, of what it was or why it was or anything like that. They knew how to behave because that was how they were raised. Right? In the same way, they knew that on Friday afternoon, before we lit Shabbat candles, The noisy toys all went into a box, and the box lived on top of our washing machine for Shabbat. Right? Did they have they knew, okay, this is what you do on Shabbat, this is what you don't do on Shabbat, but it wasn't like, oh, come, let us study all the laws of Shabbat. It was behavioral.
That might have come later.
Well, yes.
The why.
Yeah, yes, so hopefully the whys and the learning will come later, but the reality is you can learn to, you
Right.
can
Learn to act.
learn to act without having any real knowledge of the where, the why, or the laws that underlie it, right? So if you are raised to express kindness to others, that will be a behavioral pattern, regardless of whether you learn all the laws in the Torah that sort of guide you to moral, ethical kindness and compassion. And I would maybe even go so far as to say that for many, many Jews through the ages, their behavioral practice was based less on learning than it was on this is how you behave.
Right.
Right? So,
Grandparents.
yeah, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No,
You started to say.
I was gonna say my grandparents didn't, coming from the Pale, there wasn't education, there was poverty. So, and there weren't scholars, it was just, you learned to keep kosher, you learned what not to eat, you learned
And even
modeled.
even if you wanted to say that men were given a measure of Jewish learning and education, which they were given to varying degrees, right? And women certainly were not, but how did women learn kashrut?
Their mothers.
Yes, and their mothers, their grandmothers, their aunts, their older sisters, they learned how to do without ever attending a class.
Mhm.
You know, I remember when I was studying in Israel, I was studying the certain aspects of kashrut, including soaking and salting meat and stuff like that. And you know, the teacher would start to explain stuff, and I'd go like, "Oh, you mean like this?" And you go, "Yeah, yeah." What he said, and this was how we went on for weeks. Now, was I such a brilliant student that I was able to read and understand the material better than anybody in my class, including my teacher? And the answer is
No,
no. So how did I know that?
your mother had to kosher the meat.
My grandmother, blessed
grandmother.
memory. I worked side by side with my grandmother while she was doing all of this
Yeah, you
stuff.
put the pan in the
You know,
sink,
you know,
and
so
put the meat in the
I
water
did
and
all of it.
time it.
So it was not some and I did it, and it's not like she said, well, here are the rules, and then this is, we just did it.
Yeah.
Right, and
Because
I
they
learned how to do it by doing it, and then I'm reading this going like, oh, yeah, this is, and you know, and I remember, and I'm thinking like, this is great. My teacher thinks I'm some sort of genius, and I'm not going to disabuse him of this idea, God forbid, but it was exactly, you know, and had I been a girl, I would have learned it from her the same way. And the only difference was, at a certain point in time, more and more butchers were soaking and salting meat on behalf of their business, so that people didn't have to do it anymore.
Yeah, because when I was little, Sam, meat didn't come pre-koshered. My grandfather said it was right up there with sliced bread, that you didn't have to soak the meat and all that anymore.
And I will tell you that for a protracted period of time, my grandmother was not so convinced that these guys knew what they were doing, because they weren't doing it.
They hadn't been to
Oh,
her
right.
school.
Yeah.
Right.
Right? So,
Yeah.
so yes, behavioral stuff you can absorb from your environment and just replicate it without necessarily thinking a whole lot about it. right? So I think that's part of why the rabbis don't want to say that they are co-equal, all right? Also, they have a predisposition towards learning Torah, right? So their bias is coming out, right? But they don't want to say learning is because they recognize that Judaism is not theoretical. Being an expert in Jewish stuff from the rabbinic point of view makes no sense unless it translates into behavioral patterns. What's the point of becoming, this is their perspective, a scholar of Torah and not observing Judaism?
Right.
It makes no sense to them that you can study something as an academic discipline. Right? That was not a model that they understood. Right? Today you can. I mean, there are plenty of people who have degrees in Jewish studies who are not practically observing Jews, but they're very knowledgeable. But Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Tarfon, who are having this debate about which is more important, would go like, I just don't understand you. How do you study God's word and not emerge behaviorally driven? Remember, Rabbi Tarfon, who was advocating on behalf of you always forget which one's doing what. But let's say Rabbi Tarfon was advocating on behalf of study, is not then saying, well, okay, so you study Torah, great. Go home, you don't have to do Shabbos. Yeah, but this is not the way he's asking a more theoretical and basic question almost of what's the best way to do Judaism? Do you study it and then translate it into action, or do you live it and by living it, learn? Okay. Let's move on because we only have a few minutes left and I want to finish our Mishnah. All right. And anyone who talks too much will fall into sin.
Yeah, excessive speech leads to sin. That's what ours says. But
Right.
if you to talk a lot, you could have run your mouth and not pay attention to what you're saying, or you just ramble on or come out with the wrong thing.
Mhm.
You need to think sometimes before you put your foot in your mouth.
Yes, yeah. My mother, of blessed memory, always used to say to her class, please attach brain to tongue before setting tongue in motion. All right, but it takes us back to the first one where he talks about silence. Because it comes back to the idea of speak when you have something important or consequential to share. Do not feel the need to fill the void of silence with verbiage. Right? Plus, I think he's also pointing us in the direction that speech has the capacity to either elevate or debase. You can elevate someone or you can elevate speech through study, through conversation, through debate and discussion, through compliment and positive words spoken, or speech can be vulgar. Speech can be gossip. Speech can be idle chatter that usually just fills a void, but doesn't really do more than create verbal clutter, and much less, using speech to fabricate or to lie. Right? So, like any other tool or any other construct, how it's used is ultimately whether it's a positive or a negative. By the way, think about this in the context of the world we are living in today. You know, if speech can be elevating, it's because it's the product of thoughtful discourse, substantive study, and discussion. However, what we're seeing is far too much of the other type of speech where it's used instead of to knit together diverse people, it creates enmity instead of amity.
It's almost like the difference between a lecture in physics and a lab in physics. Where, one is you get the theory, you get the formulas handed, and an explanation maybe, but then you go into the lab and you say, okay, we're going to perform this process that so-and-so did and recapitulate it kind of thing. So there you have to, there's a whole lot of other things that have to go into that process than just thinking about why, that kind of thing. So with kids, I think it's, that's the way we children learn is seeing things and being there and witnessing or actually taking place or learning how to do things.
Mhm.
And then suddenly we're at bar mitzvah, or, we're 13, now I am a man. But,
Or a fountain pen, depending.
right, the process still continues with the lab of life, I guess. So that's good.
Edmund Flegg, who was a Jewish thinker of the 20th century, said, children have never been very good at listening to their parents, but they've always been very good at emulating them. And he speaks a basic truth. If I tell you to do X, I can tell you to do X from now till the cows come home. If I do the inverse of X, then my child learns that X is really not that important. In which case, if X is not important for you as an adult, why should it be important for me as a kid? Not to mention the fact that it just raises a whole lot of, why are you telling me to do what you are not prepared to do yourself? Okay, that is our Mishnah. Next week, we get Rabban Shimon, the more adult version, and we'll see what he has to say, and we'll finish chapter 1. Woohoo!
Yeah. Do you do a chazak?
No. That it's interesting. There is in traditional texts a formula that is often added at the end of a chapter. I don't even know that it's in our Siddur. I'll have to look before next week.
There was a blessing before learning.
Yes, there is.
Before we did Hebrew online, they used to say it first.
Will you go on a short stroll with me so I can ask a question?
Thank you, Rabbi.
I think most of the Passover books are together from when I pulled out the other book for Purim and Shabbat. So if you want after Thursday, Minyan.
Oh, he would. I'm not gonna be able to get to it before I have to go away for Passover. Just the
Yeah, I know.